This video contains discussions of fictionalized sexual violence, and it has a couple of instances of flashing lights being shown on screen. Both times that there are flashing lights, I'm going to do a verbal announcement with a timestamp, and if you want more details, you can go to the pinned comment where I have a more detailed content warning with some timestamps. Lately, I've been more curious than usual about rape and revenge, and the ways that both the rape and the revenge are represented in film. Today, I'm touching primarily on the revenge side of things, because arguably that's what Miss 45's story centers on, and that's the movie that we're talking about today. Miss 45 is a really difficult film to tackle, not only because of the subject matter, but also because it's so dense. Even me just saying the movie centers on the revenge side of things is to some extent fallacious. There's just too much there. Since I watched it a couple of months ago, I have not been able to get it off of my mind, so welcome to Vanessa Jupiter's sitting room. I need to talk about Miss 45, otherwise I'm never going to be able to move on with my life. I am against revenge in the real world. Thankfully, we are not talking about the real world here, but the way that I interact with fictional stories. And my boundaries for what is good and bad are much looser in that context. That means that there are indeed examples of characters enacting revenge and me as the viewer feeling some sense of catharsis through that. Furthermore, unless explicitly stated otherwise, fictional stories should not be taken as a manual guide on how to interact with the world. So, a graphic brutal rape scene is one of the easiest ways to have me root for some type of vengeance to take place. I doubt I'm alone in this, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why so many people are fascinated by rape and revenge. This is how Miss 45 starts. Thana is raped by two separate men. The first one escapes, and she manages to kill the second one. It's a satisfying kill. I wanted him to die. Good. The movie's been going on for like 12 minutes. What's next? Thana shoots a guy who follows her on the streets in a scene that I don't treat so much as a revenge scene, but rather as Thana realizing that she could kill people other than rapists, or rather, that she could kill men other than rapists. The first man she very deliberately chooses to kill is a guy who was stalking and harassing her in the street. His lines of dialogue feel awfully true to me, and the way he gets disgustingly sexist really gets to me. So, when he takes her to his apartment, I'm expecting Thana to kill him, and I'm satisfied when she does. A little later in the film, she goes out at night as a vigilante. A straight couple is having a fight, and the man starts getting physically abusive. Also deserves to be killed, by my narrative standards. Domestic abuse, like rape, is a form of violence that exists so much in the real world that seeing fictionalized versions of it being taken down immediately feels good to me. Then, things take a turn. Or, I mean, they do for me. Thana is accosted by a group of men who seem to want to mug her. Patriarchy certainly plays a role in this scene. These men are clearly accosting her in this particular way because they are men and she's a woman. But they're also poor? Thana lives a relatively financially comfortable fashion designer life. Class and class struggles have been on the background of the movie so far, but this is where it's pushed closer to the forefront. This scene begs the question, why is Thana approaching this vigilante persona like this? She's more likely to target men who are themselves victims of an unfair system. Men who might be socially positioned as allowed to harass people, and women in particular, but who may actually need to, for example, steal money to survive. This is becoming a lot more interesting, right? Thana isn't an infallible hero, and her idea of vengeance might come from misguided attempts to correct social ills that cannot be solved individually, even though individual men absolutely do need to stop raping, stalking, or harassing women. She's failing to see the bigger picture. And finally, still on this first night out, she's taken inside a car by a man who thinks she's a sex worker. When he offers her money, she kills him. Again, a few different social issues being touched on here. Acknowledging that women may resort to sex work and may practice it unsafely because that's the only way they have to produce an income for themselves is an important line of thinking, but it ignores a lot of immediate concerns, especially when it's framed as men who want to hire sex workers are worthy of punishment. Are they? Why? And more importantly, who will be negatively impacted by that? Is this framing in any way helping the real lives of real sex workers? And if you think it helps, how? Sex workers need to be protected from predators, 100%. But this isn't the way to go about it. Thanos' attack here could be argued to be causing more harm than good. This is really interesting, and as I said, a really dense way to start a narrative about someone creating a vigilante persona. There's a de-escalation in the level of violence committed by the men that Thanos chooses to kill. Thanos' killings go from understandable and justified to misguided at best, actively harmful at worst, quite quickly. I'm not very keen on the idea that certain stories should be specifically told by certain people. I think that the process of creating characters can come from a variety of different places and become a variety of different things, regardless of how much a creator is drawing from their own lived experiences when doing so. Specifically in the context of rape and revenge, we'll often hear people say that they don't want stories about women survivors told by men anymore. While I would disagree with that in a vacuum, it is also true that the genre has been way too heavily dominated by men for way too long, and my personal favorite depictions of sexual violence have had at least one woman, either as a writer or a director. So yeah, I get where this demand is coming from. Now, even without talking about the sexual violence in specific, Miss 45 is very much a story about a woman living in a patriarchal society and reacting to that. This character's womanhood is far from incidental. This is where Write What You Know starts to make more sense to me. I don't see why people who aren't women should be the ones to tackle a story that centers womanhood this heavily. And I want to add two caveats here. One, not all stories that center on women characters, even stories that feature sexual violence, are as much about womanhood as Miss 45 is. And two, and the more complicated, is that filmmaking is a complex and dynamic process that involves a lot of people, and some of whom sometimes go uncredited, often because of misogyny. Go figure. I am considering that Miss 45 is a movie made by men because, to my knowledge, that's mostly true. But even actors have a hand in how stories are represented. Removing the agency of actress Zoe Lund from the creative process of Miss 45 could itself be problematic. According to interviews, the script of the film was minimal, so actress Zoe Lund might have been more in charge of how the character is represented than we might expect just reading the credits. That being said, she was 17 at the time, and Abel Ferrara, the director, was also the actor playing the first rapist. When I think of a situation where a 17-year-old gets to the set and the director says, "So, in this next scene, I'm going to be the one raping you," the power dynamics are so heavily skewed that I have a hard time imagining it being actually okay. That being said, for all I know, that's not at all how things happened. For all I know, he was the one to play the rapist because he was actually the person that Zoe Lund felt the most comfortable with. Generally, I don't go into behind the scenes stuff, but for Miss 45 it seemed important to me, because the mere existence of the film poses some ethical dilemmas for me. If I was given the power to say yes or no to this movie being produced today, I'm not confident that I would say yes, regardless of how much I might like the final product. But then again, even this seems way too harsh of a stance for me to take, given that I don't know for a fact that there was anything bad that happened on set. If I had known for a fact that there had been abuse on set of Miss 45, probably, honestly, I wouldn't even talk about the movie in this channel. As is, I'm happy to have made this section, and now I can move on, looking at the movie for what it is. Speaking of giving myself the hypothetical power to say yes or no to decisions, there's one thing in Miss 45 that I wish I could change. Some context. Tana is disabled. Um, she can't speak. While watching the movie for the first time, I actually thought that the rapes had been the cause of her losing her voice due to trauma. But a few scenes later, it's very clear that the people that she works with knew her not to speak already before. Upon my second viewing, I actually realized that the characters around her infantilize her all the time because of her disability. This is how her story ends. And flashing lights warning, skip to this time code to avoid the flashing lights, and if you need to know what happens in this scene, in the pinned comment I have some descriptions of the scene. My first reaction to this scene was that it was by far the worst moment in the movie. The reason why I don't like the scene is because it makes Thana being unable to speak mean something instead of just being a trait. And of course, audiences could and probably would have put a lot of interpretation into her silence before this scene and even without it. But with it, it just takes whole new, huge metaphorical proportions. I mentioned my misinterpretation of the beginning precisely because I think that that could have helped a little bit. We see Thana being robbed of her voice in the beginning, and by the end of the story, she has found her voice again. Like many things in the movie, the voice metaphor is obvious in a way that makes it seem almost trite. But it's done in such a complicated way that it ends up warranting closer inspection. The main thing of note here is that her finding her voice doesn't come when she's actually avenging herself. It comes as she's being stabbed by her friend. If her voicelessness is a response to the patriarchy, what can you make of the fact that this is what needs to happen for her to speak? To me, the most obvious reading would be that Thana was so single-mindedly thinking that men were the only group of people who could actually hurt her, that when a woman is ultimately the one to kill her, the image of the oppressor loses its shape. Whatever it was that Thana saw as the thing taking away her power doesn't exist in the way that she previously thought.
Genuinely stunned that violence is not so clearly demarcated along gendered lines in terms of both victims and perpetrators, Thana dies in shock.
The fact that Thana could never speak, as a metaphor, means that she's always been oppressed by the patriarchy, which, of course, she has. Are we to take the final act that killed her as something divorced from the patriarchy, given that it's what gives her her voice? We see her friend as a non-patriarchal force. Her finding her voice would indicate that there are things that supersede the patriarchy, which I don't like. In our society, the patriarchy stains everything and everyone. The voice metaphor gets so messy so quickly that I personally think it's unsalvageable. Sometimes stories don't make perfect logical sense. Whenever encountering something that defies logic, it might be tempting to ding at a plot hole, but much more interesting conversations often come from looking at this logic-defying thing as a deliberate choice. There is one big element in Miss 45 that defies all logic. The body bags. After killing her second rapist, Thana dismembers him and puts each body part into a separate body bag and spends the rest of the movie depositing these body bags into separate parts of the city. And this doesn't make any sense. Once she notices her landlady's dog, Phil, will get to Phil, was picking up on the fact that something was in the fridge. She could have just spent a night depositing all of the body bags in different parts of the city, since that's what she was going to do anyway. Especially given that she clearly doesn't have a problem spending a night or two in the streets. So we should ask, what is this huge part of the movie doing? Or trying to do? The body parts are stinky and impossible to ignore once they're found. Thana had one of the most brutal encounters she could have had with the patriarchy, and now she no longer can ignore its existence. Now, she wants to make sure no one else can either. She's going to take that revelation and smear it in the stinkiest way possible all over the city. And in one case at least, in another city as well. This is one aspect of the movie that I really like. I actually don't think that Miss 45 would have stayed with me as much as it did if it didn't feature this bizarre element to it. In a revenge story that feels more often than not misguided, challenging symptoms instead of root causes, the body bag disposal seems to challenge actual structural problems a lot more head on than any of the killings that Tana does. And another part that I like is that, for all we know, it fails. While we see the killings being reported on the news, the only person we ever see finding a body bag on the streets is a homeless man who is himself also framed as a victim of an unfair system. Not necessarily the person who should be receiving this message the most. Which is to say, while this method might seem a lot more effective to a viewer like me, the movie challenges that idea. Is smearing the violence existence of the patriarchy all over the city really doing any good? Or is it actually causing people who are already marginalized to be in an even worse place? For the record, I don't think I agree with a thesis statement like the one I just proposed. I think that having people be aware of the existence of extreme violence in the systems that are currently in place in the world is an important step into creating a better society. Having a movie that arguably challenges my worldview is interesting to me. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the rape and revenge genre more broadly. Recently, a movie called Violation came out, and it's making a bit of a splash among rape and revenge viewers. One of the narratives that has been constructed around it is that it saps the formulaic triumphant catharsis from our expectations of the genre. And when I read takes like this, my immediate reaction is this is a really unfair assessment of the genre. I would agree that catharsis is a staple of rape and revenge, but a triumph? Not even I Spit on Your Grave, arguably the most famous rape and revenge movie, comes across as triumphant to me. I think there are certainly movies that feature rape and revenge where the revenge is framed in a very triumphant way. And I actually think that I Spit on Your Grave could be argued to be one of those movies. We all receive stories differently. I'm saying all of this because one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about Miss 45 on this channel is because after finishing the movie, I went online and I read some random reviews, and a lot of people were talking about having experienced a lot of catharsis from the end, and it seemed like a lot of people had found the ending of Miss 45 and a lot of the revenge in Miss 45 to be triumphant. My reaction to reading those takes was, did we watch the same movie? I got really defensive, and I thought that this video would be a lot more confrontational, making the case that the movie's intended message was maybe being missed by a lot of random reviewers online. The horror! I know. The climax of the movie takes place at a Halloween party. I'm about to show the other scene that features a lot of flashing lights. This one is going to be easier to understand through context clues based on what I say later. So just skip to this time code if you need to avoid flashing lights. The way it's shot, the acting, the costumes, the music, the horror, most of the scene is probably as close to perfection as it could possibly be. And to me, it doesn't pull any punches in terms of finishing the representation of Tana's vengeance as misguided. After making us sympathize with her early on and then following her on a mission of revenge that becomes more and more morally complicated, this final scene still manages to have a level of sympathy towards her, but also look at these victims. Listen to the sound effects. These people are terrified, and the movie wants us to feel the fear alongside them. I read the Halloween scene as a perfect culmination of the de-escalation that I mentioned before. Thana has taken her revenge against men who were less and less complicit with the patriarchal structures that she wanted to challenge, and the party scene solidifies that. And then, as if we needed any more confirmation that this scene is tragic and horrific, Thana is stabbed on the back by one of her best friends. I, Vanessa Jupiter, cannot for the life of me find any sense of triumph, especially not for Thana, with the ending of Miss 45. I only understood how anyone else could after I watched Violation. I'd argue that the main difference between Violation and most rape and revenge movies is mostly aesthetic and stylistic. Miss 45 has a fun score, it has fun costumes, and it has scenes that are instantly iconic. Violation, on the other hand, refuses to be a fun watch. As tragic as that Halloween scene from Miss 45 is, and as much as I read it earnestly, it does veer close to melodrama. Doing a beat-for-beat account of the story might make it seem like the thesis statement of the movie is unambiguously that revenge is bad. But now I understand why the aesthetics might communicate something different to someone else. To me, the slow-mo, the dramatic sounds, and even the scream that I went on detail about not liking in the previous segment, none of those things make the movie feel any less real or less painful. Because to me, this language of hyper extra emotionality doesn't suck away the real feeling of tragedy from the story. Just to conclude, I want to touch a little bit on gender, given that I am indeed a non-binary drag queen, and Miss 45 has a lot of characters who feel very gender about the world. Thana clearly divides the world into men and women, and not only are men universally bad, but she can also recognize what a man looks like just by looking at them, even if they are not presenting in a stereotypically masculine way. In the party scene, Thana sees a man in a bridal gown, and this moment is really fascinating because this is the one person who makes her hesitate. She wonders if this man dressed as a woman is still the enemy, and she ultimately decides that, yes, he is. After this, the visuals of the movie seem to confirm Thana's perspective by having him lose his wig, making him appear more masculine to the audience. But then, just to keep us on our toes, the movie goes ahead and has a woman be the one to kill Thana.
It is no coincidence that it is a man in drag and a woman in a leotard tuxedo wielding a crotch-level phallic knife that cause her downfall. Thana's assumptions of an us versus them scenario collapses with tragic results at these ambiguous sexual identities.
While Thana's perspectives on gender are certainly regressive, exclusionary, and essentialistic, I think it's fair to say that the movie's perspective is more nuanced than that. There's a scene, mostly divorced from the main plot, where a homeless woman just happens to be spewing misogynistic rhetoric in the street. The movie doesn't present the world as women good and men bad, or even as men are the only enforcers of patriarchy. The very final scene is the revelation that Thana chose not to kill Phil, her landlady's dog, even though we had been previously led to believe that she had. It wouldn't have made sense for Thana to kill Phil. Previously in the film, we saw Thana reacting to a man talking about having killed a pet as being the final straw that she needed to want to kill him, even though up to that point it was pretty much the first man that we ever saw her being vaguely sympathetic towards. Tana killing Phil would be the type of contradiction that not only makes Tana into a huge hypocrite, but also pushes her way too far into the evil side of things. Part of the reason why the movie works is because even though we might disagree with Tana's retaliation, we understand how she got here. Not only is the movie sympathetic towards Tana until the end, I am. I like Tana. I really like the final moment showing Phil. Tana's decision not to kill him reads to me as a revelation that she hadn't actually submitted to the us versus them worldview, as the previous scenes would have led us to believe. It somehow makes her death even more tragic. While Tana certainly went much further in her quest for vengeance than she should have, maybe there was still a chance that she would, who knows, see the errors in her ways. Hi, thank you so much for watching. I would not have made this video, or at the very least, it would have been a very different video if I hadn't read the book Rape and Revenge Movies, Critical Study by Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. I pulled a couple of quotes from the book earlier, and even the final quote that I posted on the screen by Kier-La Janisse, I actually found on, like, I first read this quote on the book of Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. I'm going to link, like, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas, or at least, like, her page and, like, more about her book down below. And the article that she references in the book, where the quote from Kier-La Janisse comes from, is also linked below. I hope that you liked this video if you watched it all the way through. This one in particular, I feel like a lot of people might disagree a lot with the things that I said, and I'm interested in that. Yeah, like, share your opinions on Miss 45 if you have any. Share your opinions on what I said about Miss 45 if you have any. Share your opinions on Rape and Revenge as a whole if you have any opinions. Usually what I say in the outros is, let me know in the comments, like, share, subscribe, tag me on your Instagram stories, quote me on your dissertation thesis, but I'm less and less in love with this call to action in the end, so right now I'm putting a little lampshade on it. Love, Vanessa Jupiter.